myself. So I guess, first, thank you all for coming. To contextualize this panel specifically, it's part of the larger university program that's celebrating the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And how this relates to that theme will be something that I think evolves as we present, because I think all of us are still kind of figuring out how we can engage with the rest of the university's theme. My name is Keaton Potts, like I said. This is Jonesy Laren. This is Andy. Sorry, Marquis. Yeah, okay. And that's John Milgram. John Milgram's our moderator, and these are the panelists who will be joining me. In introducing the panel, I want to talk about some motivating questions that we had and I had for choosing this as our topic, which is the unifying power of education. I want to talk about some considerations and some cautions that we have in engaging with this topic, and then also talk about why I invited the people I invited. So, and they haven't heard this before, so it might get cheesy or savvy. You've been warned now. So, some motivations I had in mind for, some questions I had in mind when putting together this panel is one that I think I hear a lot, which is, what is education for? Especially when people find out that I'm doing philosophy, that's when the question particularly comes up. And I think the most common response I've heard is just a job. But although I agree with this, I think that there's something a lot more deep and meaningful that you can get out of an education. And I understand this as a special kind of perception that helps you spot and understand a problem. And once this problem has been uncovered, part of realizing it is being motivated to act in a way that can deal with the problem. So I think philosophy does a particularly good job of building this kind of perception and motivational response, but I think many disciplines do it. I should also note now that all of the people on the panel are philosophers or are studying philosophy, if they're not willing to make the claim that they're philosophers yet. So that'll probably shape our discussion in a more theoretical way, but hopefully we'll be able to get practical too. So another motivating question was, where and how is this dream unified? Any kind of dream that is fueling a social movement or any kind of activism like that? And I think that this happens a lot of times. The dreams start and are fueled by classroom settings. So the classroom and education as an institution in general are very important for this kind of social activism. Okay, so in terms of addressing these questions, we'll start after I'm done with my introduction with Jonesy Laren's presentation, the title of which is up there, pretty much talking about the civil rights movement and the role that the institution of education played during that movement, and some lessons that can be learned and applied in today's setting, to oversimplify it. Then I'll give us a look at the role that teachers play in reproducing norms that can disillusion or disenfranchise students, but also hopefully try and find some positivity in what teachers can do or might be called to do in order to question these norms and reform them. Then we'll wrap up with Andy, and his discussion might have changed since I last wrote this, so I might be mischaracterizing it, only time will tell. But my understanding is that he'll give some personal stories that kind of ground us in things that are actually happening in the classrooms and how the best intentions can go awry sometimes. Is that fairly accurate?
It is.
Okay. So I think it's very clear, and I want to be cautious about when I speak for the other panelists and the moderator, but I think this is something that we can all agree upon. A panel that is celebrating the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. should not be all white. So that's something that we want to be very cautious about. I don't think that the range of authority that we have in engaging this topic is very narrow. So I encourage audience members to call into question when we might be overstepping this authority, and hopefully this will lead to fruitful discussion. This is just an invitation, because if we are the only ones who speak throughout this panel, we'll be missing a great deal. So that's my invitation. Let's see.
Do we just want to maybe give a quick structural account of like how it came to be that this is an all-white panel?
Yeah. So that's where I should have gone with that. I was approached in December by Dr. Gordon, who works with the Center for the Study of Ethics, asking me to put together a panel in celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. And I accepted because I thought it'd be a great opportunity, and it has shown to be. However, it has also shown to be a more challenging opportunity than I might have first anticipated. I was asked to bring philosophy students together And the hope is that we'd be able to solicit participation from other graduate students. And that might be in part my failure, that I wasn't able to reach out to other departments and get a more diverse or representative sample for our panel. But
I just want to say we should qualify that by saying we're a very small department, and unfortunately, right now, there are no people of color in the department, and that's something a lot of philosophy departments struggle with. They have really tried hard to promote diversity and inclusion actively over the past half century or so, but it's not there yet. And part of that, there are structural and institutional reasons for, as there are in many fields, and part of that is because they have the student body that they have, and there's a lot of students that might go into philosophy departments that, if they are from a marginalized group, will tend to go into other areas of academic study that they see as having a more immediate impact on that struggle. So, but I would just encourage everyone here, particularly for our part of marginalized group, take a couple of philosophy classes if it intersects with your interests, and if you have the ability to, and judge for yourself whether you think it's something worth pursuing further. Because it would be in everyone's interest to get that engagement and participation. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and say, well, because this has historically been dominated by white men, therefore marginalized people shouldn't study it or engage in it. I think quite the opposite is true. Medicine's been dominated by white men too. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go to a doctor if you're sick. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Jen. That's actually a great transition into a demonstration of what I'm going to talk about next. And that's why I've invited the people I've invited. So, as Jen was saying, I think two main things that I like to highlight when I talk about why philosophy is particularly problematic is I think that this disillusionment comes from the language that people typically use in philosophy. It's very jargon intensive, like a lot of fields, but I think when coupled with the method of philosophy, or philosophy as it's typically understood as armchair reflection type thing, can seem very foreign and not inviting. So that's why I've invited the philosophers that I have, because I think that John, Andy, and Jen all do a very good job of trying to make philosophy accessible, to be inviting in the way that they teach and do philosophy, and also use philosophy as a way to engage not only the university community, but the community outside the university, which I think all of us take to be a duty of academics. So I tried to break this down into three kind of areas where I've seen my fellow panelists and moderator operate. One is research, one's teaching, and one's just outside the classroom. In terms of research, I know that everyone who is up here with me is deeply concerned with not only the theoretical side of debates, but also the practical. So trying to bring this down to bear on the society that we're in and the issues that are faced by people, if not every day, a lot of the time. Also, in terms of teaching, everyone on the panel shows a very intense compassion for the education of others around them. So I've had a really great opportunity to see everyone here engage with undergraduates, I think exclusively undergraduates. But the way that they approach teaching is really important in that they are trying to get involvement, and if that means modifying the language that they use or the method of philosophy in order to try and solicit this engagement, they're more than happy to do it, and are particularly good at doing this kind of thing. And finally, outside the classroom, whether this is strictly philosophy or more social justice, I know that everyone here is involved in those kinds of pursuits as well. So, without further ado, that's why the panel is the way that it is, and moving forward, we'll go through between 10 and 15 minutes for each of the panelists, and I'll turn it over to John, our moderator, at this point. Thank you again for coming.
I am the moderator tonight. I'm very unimportant. My picture is on the poster, like I'm actually important, but it's because I'm the sucker that followed the rules and didn't have my picture taken earlier this or last year, and nobody else did. So that's why my picture's on there. So following the rules actually gets you places, apparently. The format, as Keegan said, is will be each moderator or each panelist will be speaking for, he said 10 to 15 minutes. It's actually going to be 12 minutes. And I will hold them to fairly close to 12 minutes. I ask everyone to please hold your comments. Everyone, audience and panel members included, to please hold your comments and don't interrupt the panelists as they're speaking. All three are going to speak, and we're going to do discussions and questions after question while it's going on, you don't have to wait until they're all done speaking to let me know. Just raise your hand, and we're gonna do kind of a standard philosophy thing we do. I don't know if it's standard everywhere else. If you have a question, just raise a finger, and I'll make note of where you are in the queue. And then once they're all finished, then I will call on people. And then once we start taking questions, if you have a follow-up question or an addition to someone else's question, raise 2 fingers, and we can skip over to you so that we stay on the same topic. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gen G Learning.
So we also discussed it, and we felt it was appropriate for each of us to give brief personal kind of preface or comment to say why we hope that we are qualified and have something to contribute here, even though we're all late. So I'll just say, for my case, the reason I feel like I have something to add and that is because I'm from the South and I'm queer. And I come from a small rural community in Virginia where, most people were in the closet and there really was no community to speak of. And in fact, there weren't many Hispanic, Latino people. So the role model and the example that I had to look to, the history that I had available to me to learn and understand was the struggle for Black liberation and equality in America. And so that was what was proximate to me growing up. That was the example I had to look to, and that's the history that I studied. And that's where I go when I need ideas or inspiration or historical parallels for that struggle ongoing today and for other marginalized communities and contemporary struggles. That's just the framework that I look to study, hey, what works and what doesn't. So I hope I have something to add. And I got some prepared remarks here. I could focus about, honestly, my remarks are not too philosophical. I could talk about like the legal significance of overturning Plessy versus Ferguson with the Brown verdict, but I wanna step back and look sociologically and politically at why this was significant and why, in my opinion, the gains made in the 60s would not have been possible without this happening first. So I'll read the prepared remarks I have and then go impromptu if I have time. It is a sad but undeniable truth that most Americans, if asked, are hard-pressed to name more Supreme Court cases than they can count on one hand. Yet, even among the swath of our citizenry, the name Brown v. Board is ubiquitous and meaningful. Though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were undeniable in their impact and their transformative effect on American life and politics, and the bitter struggle to fully implement and enforce these laws and see that everyone enjoys their protections still continues today, the end of racially segregated schooling and the legal principle of separate but equal that had undergirded it had a special significance and power that helped to make those later legal and political victories possible by bringing about a deeper kind of change in people's hearts and minds, in their consciousness and awareness of the struggle and cruelty faced by Black and Brown Americans, even as children. Laws and systems of discrimination such as the slave codes or Jim Crow regime in America or the apartheid regime in South Africa are only as strong as the willingness of the favored group to adhere to them or at least to abide by them. Under these systems, a majority of white citizens may not have been actively racist in the sense of committing acts of violence, acting or campaigning against the welfare of Black Americans, or otherwise participating in white supremacy in a hands-on way rather than simply benefiting from it passively. However, the genius of those systems was that it prevented these more benign white citizens from spending any time around or interacting with Black Americans. And absent any firsthand experience which would foster in empathy and allow them to see that the targeted minority group is no different and no less human than themselves, they are free to paint in their mind or to passively absorb from the propaganda of the oppressor a crude and detestable caricature of what the other is that serves to justify the system of segregation, and therefore to render it morally permissible in their minds. By way of illustration, a majority of white people in the Confederacy had never owned slaves, and in fact were gravely harmed economically by the institution of slavery. And yet many of these same poor white men actively fought and died to protect wealthy slaveholders precisely because they had never been permitted to spend any time working or socializing with Black people, and therefore were readily able to believe that it must be this way for a reason, and that Black men were violent, primitive beasts who had to be held in bondage in order to prevent them from running amok, terrorizing them and their families. The reason that this economic majority of poor whites was never employed in any capacity on the plantations, even for the most pitiful of wages, was not just for the sake of greed. It was because the slaveholders understood that if white workers spent any time near Black workers and came to see A, how they were treated, and B, that their desires, motivations, hopes, fears, emotions, and even cultural and educational frame of reference was not much different from theirs, they would quickly come to realize how greatly they had been deceived and kept from gainful employment, and how much more they had in common with the slave than the slaveholder. This is part of our nature as mammals and primates. The capacity, and indeed I would argue, the primal need and drive we have to empathize and communicate with each other, which is what allowed us to survive and thrive as a species through cooperation, communication, and collective effort, even in the harshest of climates, surrounded by no shortage of other life forms that were stronger, faster, bigger, tougher than we were. We can't help it. We are built to feel each other's pain, but only if we can see it with our own eyes and hear it with our own ears. We are not yet so evolved as to be able to empathize through abstraction. We must know with our senses that our fellow Homo sapiens are in pain. It must be tangible and real to us. And this is a double-edged sword, because if we cannot see the suffering of other human beings, we would greatly prefer to believe that it must not be occurring, so that we not even feel any pain, guilt, or discomfort ourselves. And we will therefore go to any lengths and grasp at any straw we can in order to rationalize or justify that belief and say, they aren't like us. They don't feel what we feel. They can't be trusted. They don't have the same mental faculties that we do. They don't think as we do. It has to be this way. They're too dangerous to be around us. We have no choice. It's not as bad as they say it is. It can't be. They must be lying. We wouldn't hurt them for no reason. We couldn't do that. Nobody could. We are incapable of it. I'm not capable of that. They must have done something to deserve it. We're just protecting ourselves. It has to be this way. This is why public education is of such paramount importance to any civil rights struggle or social justice movement. Because even more important than the quality or focus of the education itself, schools are the institutions in which all people, from a young age and from all walks of life, all identities and economic and cultural groupings are encouraged and indeed required to be together, side by side, in an environment where they are all safe and all respected, no matter what is happening or what they are told at home or in society at large. The forces of willful white supremacy understood this as well as anyone, which is precisely why they and their politicians and their police were prepared to use martial violence in Little Rock and across the South against children trying to enter elementary schools, which was the rock bottom level of depravity that was necessary for us to reach, and for passive, non-racist whites to see with their own eyes before they were finally prepared to understand what was being done in their name and to be galvanized to action to oppose it. When President Johnson, after sending the National Guard to finally execute the Brown decision and successfully forcing through and signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, famously remarked to his staff that we have just lost the South for a generation. He said a generation, not forever, because he understood full well that once black and white children were finally allowed to sit side by side while they learned their ABCs, Jim Crow would never be allowed to rise again, because the KKKs and the CCCs would no longer have a steady stream of ignorant white adults ready to believe whatever they were told about black Americans because they had never truly known a black American. Tragically, in today's America, those same forces hold powers again. And we who stand for justice and equality for all must remember the lessons of history that made these victories possible, because those forces, have not forgotten. And they also remember well the taste of their defeat. This, my friends, is why the unparalleled assault on the civil rights, freedoms, safety, and very humanity of gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex, and gender non-conforming Americans that we are about to witness has begun in the same place that the ongoing struggle for black liberation and equality began, with our public education system. Other laws are coming. Laws which will allow the refusal of service to LGBT people by any private business or even public servants and institutions. Laws which will allow an emergency room doctor to let me bleed to death on the floor because he claims that his so-called religion decrees me to be less than human. Laws which will make it legal in all 50 states, instead of just the 35 or so that it is presently, to evict, fire, or refuse to hire someone because of their gender expression or sexual orientation, because a poverty rate of 1 in 2 for some of these groups isn't high enough. Laws that will openly allocate government money to subsidize the torture and abuse of gay and trans children in so-called reparative therapy, which drives many to suicide and substance abuse. Laws would shun, stigmatize, and segregate trans and intersex Americans and require them to use separate bathrooms or hospital rooms, or be turned away from homeless shelters or other public facilities when they flee from abusive homes. Laws which will abolish hate crimes legislation because the murder rate of 1 in 7 for trans women of color isn't high enough for these people. Laws which will allow those same women to be thrown in men's prisons for having the audacity to defend themselves from being beaten or killed, while guards joke and take bets about how many times they'll be raped in a night. And that's happened. I can give you 2 cases of that in the past 6 months alone. Laws championed by the same men, smug, slick, pale white politicians in their dark gray suits looking into the camera to tell you all the same things, that this is about their freedom to discriminate, that queer people are marked by God as inferiors, and that having to breathe the same air as us is an affront to their spiritual beliefs. That they don't hate us or want to kill us at all. They just think we shouldn't be able to work, go to school, join the military, go to the hospital, or have insurance coverage, get married, adopt children, receive any government services, or be served in any public business or accommodation, or use indoor plumbing. Against any of these atrocities and compared to some of the battles that lay ahead in the coming years, it may seem easy to forget about education. That discrimination in schools is a less urgent or imperative issue than the matters which have an immediate life or death outcome. But the exact opposite is true. Any adult with a shred of reason or conscience knows that any one of those things is an outrage and an affront to civil society. But children do not. The queer child who learns that they are a second-class citizen from the time they are in kindergarten will not know any better. The straight child who is taught that we are animals who either must be shunned, exploited, or abused for sport from the time they are old enough to speak will not know any better either, unless they are taught. If queer Americans, our friends and loved ones, and any and every citizen of conscience and conviction does not remember the lessons taught to us by the struggle of Black Americans and the importance of the Brown verdict, the violent resistance to it and the struggle that was necessary to gain all even greater victories and systemic changes that were made possible as a result. If we allow segregation, abuse, and apartheid back into our public schools, then I fear that LGBTQIA Americans will have lost not only their freedom, but their dignity, opportunities, and their very humanity for a generation. What we are looking at now under the Trump administration, if Betsy DeVos gets confirmed as Secretary of Education, then we have a woman whose family has given millions of dollars. John, how much time do I have? Okay,
Take
all right.
20 seconds to finish up.
All right, well, let me just say briefly that between, we found out this week that they're having a panel on higher education and changes to be made by higher education that's going to be led by Jerry Falwell Jr. We have Betsy DeVos coming in as Secretary of Education, who's contributed millions of dollars to oppressive causes, to stripping legal rights from LGBT people, and who wants to basically protect bullying and discrimination in schools. We have the so-called religious freedom bill being debated, similar to the one Mike Pence championed and signed in Indiana. Unprecedented assaults on voter rights and the ability to get legal identification that's necessary in order to vote. And none of this is happening in a vacuum. And all marginalized and oppressed peoples have to stand together in opposition to it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So in approaching this topic in the panel, I was motivated by my teaching responsibilities in my career. I want to be a teacher, and I think I'm continually challenged by the difficulty of the necessity for having the power differential within a classroom and a hierarchy, having the teacher be able to maintain order in the classroom, but also having topics that will come up in the classroom that the teacher does not have authority to speak on. So these, when race and gender things come up in class, how does the teacher avoid co-opting or shaping or otherwise, how do they not disallow this conversation first, but then how do they allow the conversation to evolve and be fruitful while maintaining order in the classroom? And I guess that's what's motivating my discussion. But also, playing off of Jen's panel and contribution, I'll be talking about the kind of education that goes on in schools just beyond the content of the educational lessons. So the experiential learning that goes on within the classroom that can either re-solidify the norms that are disenfranchising or disillusioning people, or potentially present an opportunity to renegotiate these norms, question them, and reform them. I'm largely engaging with a woman named Beth Hatt's sociological study called Smartness as Cultural Practice in Schools. So the beginning of my presentation will discuss the ways that teachers can fail to carve out space for this kind of social activism within the classroom and social awareness and the building of cultural competency. So start with how teachers fail to do this, suggest maybe how at least I would approach the problem of solving this, which is definitely subject to questioning and further exploration in the Q&A section. Talk about a couple practices that are extremely important that I think Hat has missed in her study, and then if there's time, I'll do some more prescribing, but likely there won't be. I want to look at this along two axes, one of which is just the atmosphere of the classroom, so how people feel going into the classroom, but then also how this interacts, or how power dynamics within the classroom can shape this atmosphere in more or less good ways, and more or less bad ways. Like I said, this will be discussing largely challenging and reproducing social or cultural norms. And these are things that should be continually explored and renegotiated in the classroom. At least that's what I'm arguing for. I take as a starting point the idea that equal access to education is a fundamental right. I think many would disagree with me, but I think it's important to point this out. And I also want to point out that this access to education doesn't just mean being able to go to schools. Access to education happens within the classroom as well. So barriers can arise once students have entered the doors of the school, so to speak, and this prevents them from accessing educational resources that are essential to their development. This is a new form of segregation that's insidious and persists through, if not all, many educational institutions in the U.S. So, in discussing these cultural practices that are developed in schools, I want to introduce teachers as key players and show how focusing on teacher selection and training can add a large factor that could prevent these kinds of norms from being reproduced and breed an inclusive classroom that stimulates cultural awareness. So, talking a little bit more about Beth Hatt's study, there are two ways that she identifies how teachers can resegregate the classroom. And one of this is just artifacts, and the other is communication styles. So these are two ways that the teacher can disillusion and disenfranchise students. Think back to the time when you were in either elementary or even kindergarten. So elementary school, I can remember artifacts that communicated the same kinds of messages. The instance that she gives is a stoplight. So in the classroom that she goes into, which as I mentioned is a kindergarten classroom, this kind of thing happens early on. In the classroom, there's a stoplight at the front of the room that all the students have to look at. So obviously there's green, yellow, red, and each student has a car with their name on it. And as the student misbehaves or does something wrong throughout the day, their car first moves to yellow and then to red. And once the car is moved to red, they have to go home with a note to their parents. So this communicates some problematic things. First off, I mean, this doesn't seem too bad on the face of it, right? Like you have to have some kind of way of maintaining order in the classroom. And this is an effective way. But once we look a little bit deeper, we can see that it is furthering this idea that cultural practices are what we're evaluating when we're trying to evaluate smartness instead. So very quickly, teachers and students associate the ability to control themselves with smartness. So students who aren't able to control themselves in the classroom are seen as less intelligent than others. And I think the important thing to learn from the stoplight is that other students will then evaluate each other as more or less smart, and this creates power dynamics in the classroom that can reproduce the norms that we want to be questioning and reforming. So then there's also communication styles. Hat talks about two instances in particular. One is the Shoe Tires Club. Again, the name makes it sound like it's not that serious, but what's going on in the classroom is students who are able to tie their shoes gain access to the Shoe Tire Club membership, and all the students who can't tie their shoes have to go around and when their shoe becomes untied, they have to ask someone else to do it who knows how. That one is a little less hard to see how insidious and problematic it is. There are also instances where Hat selects students to come up and teach the classroom on certain topics that they have demonstrated knowledge about. And the problem with this is she notices that the teacher is usually selecting students that communicate in the same way that she communicates, she being the teacher. So students who can best emulate the communication style of the teacher are evaluated as more intelligent than other students, which has nothing to do with the content of what's being communicated. And it's interesting, she talks about how the students will go up and like display similar body language to the teacher, maybe hands on the hips or things like that, which I think is super problematic. So in creating these power dynamics, it's not only with students. I think one particular example was a student with a speech impediment who tested very well going in, and as these artifacts and communication styles begin to be factored into the evaluation of this student's intelligence, he internalizes the idea that he's not as intelligent as other students, becomes less interested in school, and self-selects against opportunities that would have otherwise been available to him. And this happens way outside of just speech impediments. This is how implicit racism and other biases make their way into the classroom. At least one way in which they make their way into the classroom. So, moving on to how I think teachers might be able to create environments or classroom dynamics that could disallow this disenfranchisement. There are a lot of ways of doing it. I think Andy's going to get into some discussion about that in his panel section, but my stab is just you strip down this power differential as much as you can so that it's not as, you're not allowing cultural cues and things like that to stand as indicators of intelligence. So teachers also would then have to withhold these assessments of students' intelligence far longer and be open to more ways of demonstrating intelligence than just the ones that the teacher is accustomed to. And this also means having more representative teaching bodies, as the student bodies are way more diverse than the teaching community is. This is something that has to change. So third, I want to talk about a couple practices that I think are super important that Hat has missed. Through no fault of her own, I'm sure that there were strict publication limits in terms of how many words that she could publish. But I think it's important to talk about how private versus public schools can also introduce similar kinds of barriers to access to education, and then also accelerated tracks within public schools. So I went to undergrad in Chicago. Notoriously, I think Detroit is also the same. These are both cities that struggle to have good public schools, and a lot of this is, a lot of the problems with public schools is made worse by the fact that so much investment is going into private schools. So parents who can afford to put their kids in private school are doing that, and this robs public schools and public school students of resources in a couple important ways. One is the students themselves that are going to private schools would otherwise be a resource to students in public schools. So you're getting students out of the classroom that would otherwise be able to help in the classroom, but you're also getting parents that might engage who can afford to put their kids in private schools to be able to invest more resources into public schools if only they had more incentive, i.e. if their child was going to public school, they would invest in public schools. And that also plays off of the whole problem with Betsy DeVos and the many, many issues that will result in confirming her. But maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A. Also, this happens not only within, or between private and public schools, but within public schools. I went to a public school, for instance, where they had like AP or IB tracks or accelerated tracks for enriched classes. And this does the same thing. It separates students out and gives opportunity to students who might be more adept at cultural practices, and then gives them access to opportunities that allow them to get more opportunities. And this just creates a huge divide between students and, thanks, John, students within public schools. So, like what's happening in Hat's study in public schools, students who are going through a normal track, I'll call it, which isn't accelerated, isn't enriched, quickly begin to internalize their own lack of intelligence or their own shortcomings, whether or not there actually are shortcomings. So in addition to this, the cultural or systemic kind of barriers that result, students begin self-selecting and saying, well, maybe I'm not as intelligent as I thought. Maybe I shouldn't go into this extracurricular program. Maybe I shouldn't engage in these kinds of student activities because maybe I'm just not cut out for it. So they start self-selecting, and I think that's where a lot of this becomes especially tragic. Yeah, I guess I'll just conclude with what I think, a couple things I think might help eliminate this smartness as cultural practice that Beth Hat identifies. One is just teacher training, preparing teachers to respond and to moderate discussions in classrooms arising from race and gender issues that are going on in present day. This will become more and more important. Also having a representative teaching body so that students see themselves reflected in their teachers, and also teachers who have experience with race and gender struggles of their own are more able to moderate these discussions than teachers who don't. So that's another reason this is important. And I'm not sure how strong a claim I want to make about the morality of private education, but maybe finding a way to have more investment in public schools is important. And whether or not this has an effect on enrollment or contributions to private schools, I'm not sure. But to leave more time for Q&A, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Keegan.
Okay, Andrew, you're up.
Right. So, Keegan, can I briefly look at your first page of notes? Would that be cool? All right. So, yeah.
Got notes.
I have some notes. I'm going to borrow this for just a moment. One of the things Keegan spoke about early on was this idea of teachers as key players, potentially key players at any rate. And then teachers reproduce harmful cultural norms. And I'm going to tell you how I did that. And, yeah. So, is it fine if I like? Thanks. You can get up and walk around.
Oh, man.
You want up here? Yeah, I wouldn't mind it. Cause this other like drama has been happening in the back of my head while I've been listening. When I am like in class, either as a TA or because it's my class, I always have my phone off. And I don't right now. And I've been waiting for this nightmare to happen where like Gingy or Keegan is interrupted by a phone call that I don't even know from Austin, Texas, and I'm only in Texas. Okay. So yeah, my little spiel here is called A True Story About Bad Teaching, and it's a true story about bad teaching, and I'm the culprit in the story. So I've got some questions here. I mean, it's just gonna kind of be a story, if that's cool. I was working on all week some remarks about this paper called Prioritizing Rights in the Social Justice Curriculum. And it's from 2009. It's by a guy named, he's an educational philosopher. His name's Johnston. And it was about how to ground teaching social justice to like high school students or middle school students. And he thinks that like a really good thing to do would be to like sort of have the content of the course flow from something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I was preparing this like, not exactly like a full-throated rebuttal to it, but just pushing back a little bit from the perspective of like maybe a student-centered classroom, and I feel like he wasn't quite going for that. He's an educational theorist, and the idea of like starting social justice with like grounding that in sort of a document like that, that would not be what I would do. So anyway, I was preparing a case study that involved some students that I worked with last year, and I discussed this morning. I was like, I think I've got this great anecdote, and I was telling my girlfriend there, and she said, I got 2 sentences out on this story, and she says, "Whoa, colonial white science dude, ease up." And I was like, you don't understand, like, wait a minute, let me get the story out. And I got the story out, and she knew what I was trying to say. And I was like, yeah, see? But over the course of the day, it like percolated, and I was finishing like what I thought my remarks would be. And like this thing dawned on me. And then, so that's what I'm going to share with you, is sort of just that. The part that's left once the thing dawned. So here we go. I do have a question. How many of us crossed a street today? I did. Okay, hands down. Now, also by show of hands, how many of us got struck by a car while doing so? Good, that's got that out of the way. Dan, you. All right. So Dan caught Ladybug Bear. That's Ladybug Bear. She's a black bear in a ladybug costume. So how did we all manage to cross streets without getting hit by cars? How did Dan catch Ladybug Bear? These are physics things. So here's an idea. I think that we all hold in our brains an intuitive model of the world, of physics. It's not quantum mechanics, it's not relativistic mechanics, it's not even classical mechanics, but it's a physics, it's a model of the world. And like where that comes from, so where that comes from, I think, is an interesting question. It's some combination of evolution and life experience. But we have it. And so things being what they are, the work of physics education is to revise and expand upon that intuitive model that students already hold. Start with the student, build from there. Because if you're gonna redecorate a room, you have to do something with the furniture that's already there. If you just recarpet the place, you're gonna have your cat's gonna be underneath the carpet. You have to account for what's already there. So it has to start with what the student already knows. I don't mean to just hand wave about psychological constructivism or anything. I'm really trying to get at something simpler, like student-centeredness, starting with who the student is and what they're bringing to you in that classroom. So, all right, from there, where do we go? Before coming here, I taught physics at a high school in a refugee resettlement city. I worked with students and families from all over the world. Places like Bosnia, Bhutan, Burundi, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, people with really different cultural backgrounds than the one I have. And I'm going to tell you a story about how that goes sometimes. Now, there's actually nothing essentially, I think, multicultural at the bottom of this. This kind of thing happens pretty often in classrooms. And so I'm just going to share with you an especially outrageous example. So I had a self-proclaimed favorite student. He also, coincidentally, did happen to be my favorite. And this is a story about him, or about me not doing service to him. So each year I taught, somewhere between 5 and 10 students would profess a belief in magic. And last year, my self-proclaimed favorite, he was among that group. So when we would do experiments or pretty much anything remotely cool, he would accuse me of making stuff up, of tricking the class, of rigging things. Just before holiday break, when we turned off the lights and burnt magnesium strips for no good reason, he said it was magic. I finally got to the magic of it, not rigging things. And so, if you've ever burnt a magnesium strip in a dark room, pretty magical. So to that I said, damn right, that's magic. Toward the end of the school year, but at the beginning of our projectile motion unit, we're playing around with projectile launchers. And all of the students in me were really caught up in the fact that no matter where we place the target, if we do some math, we can calculate an angle, we can launch the steel ball and hit the target. It's really fun. Time after time, we do this, and this student says, Marcus, you're rigging. So 4 weeks later, at the end of the unit, we return to the launchers. But we've got some new skills, we've got some new understandings. And the student in question here, he's solid in math. He'd taken geometry, that semester he was in Algebra 2. He needed just a touch of scaffolding to do the inverse trig functions. But point being, he does the math, he calculates the angle, he launches the steel ball, which hits the target. He says, this is great. Any number of things could be going on here, and it's not my intention to be reductive. I'm going to try not to be. But safe to say, because it was my goal was to replace the model in his head, the one he arrived in the room understanding, with a new one that was compatible with and appreciative of the Western scientific tradition. In this case, with this student, it didn't happen that way. In part, I conjecture this was because I failed to sufficiently account for this student's model of the world. This is the realization. Do you know how I know that? A few minutes ago, I said, each year I taught, somewhere between 5 and 10 students would profess a belief in magic. That's true. They did. Now, here's the question. How much more can I tell you about what they believe? None. We spent 10 months together, and I can't tell you one more thing beyond they profess to believe in magic. So colonial white science dude, that is me, sure felt pretty comfortable not taking their beliefs very seriously, like, at all. Keep in mind, my self-proclaimed favorite, he learned the mechanics of the calculations just fine, better than fine. With respect to this bigger, more important question, the one that like kind of animated me as a teacher, which is the student developing something like a scientific worldview? The limitation was mine and not his. So, in summary, 2 points. I actually failed to do my job the way I know, and like upon reflection, believe it should be done. That was the whole bit about like with the not getting hit by cars and stuff. So then that methodology is actually reflective of how I believe the job should be done. And I failed to do it because, here's the second summary point, I didn't respect my student's culture. And I didn't respect him, at least in that way. And a consequence of that lack of respect, my dismissiveness with respect to the thing he came into my room believing, I failed to teach it. I think. The safety of behind the table. I'm ready to hide again.
Okay, we can take a few questions or comments. Normally in philosophy circles, we're pretty strict about like not lecturing as you ask a question, but I don't think that's appropriate here. So if you have a comment that's actually just a comment from your own experience that you want to talk about, you're welcome to do that. So to start off, does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to add? Okay, good. Yes, sir.
I found it very important that you gave.
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing you.
I apologize. I said I find it very important that you gave comments on the fact that the panel was all white, not with the panel being all white itself, but the fact that you were commenting on the status of the actual department itself, and you were notifying how that you obviously want that to be somewhat changed, or you want to influence that, and through what you guys were actually speaking of throughout the rest of the presentation, it showed that is something that you guys are actually aiming towards changing indirectly through giving people the ability to maybe choose that more likely, or be more likely to be in that department. I feel though doing that gives people more of a, for lack of a better word, realistic sense to what is actually going on in your actual thought process. So I felt though actually opening with that was actually very important for people that were looking to, or not necessarily looking for that, or people that would want to know more about that, or would like to acknowledge that, because I'm pretty sure people would think that.
You guys have any comments on that?
Yeah, was that something you wanted us to respond to, or?
No, I was just saying,
I might actually have
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that something that we should have mentioned at the beginning as well is that philosophy has its own culture that is incredibly ridiculous and like should be easier to understand. So I think that's like the kind of angle that we're trying to take on this is you can express philosophical ideas without all that like structural jargon stuff to explain it. I think that.
See, the main trouble with professional philosophers, in my opinion, is that they only talk to other philosophers. which is what we're trying to change here. And so what happens is, yes, it's still a field that's predominantly straight white men, and but most of them absolutely have their hearts and minds in the right place. They have the right intention when it comes to promoting diversity. They would tell you that's something they want. They might even participate, actively in a hands-on way in pursuing that goal or in other social justice causes. But while they may not have any biased intent, it's just, if you start out where it's mostly white guys and then you're only ever talking to each other, then it's kind of circular. And so things have gotten a little bit better as far as gender parity. It's still, I mean, our department's less than 25 people, we only have like 5 women right now, for example, too. But yeah, we're still lagging on ethnic, racial, national diversity. So all I can say is it's there waiting for you, but people have to go in and claim the space,
Yeah, and it's not just us here. That's like a philosophy worldwide, predominantly old white. So, yeah.
Sorry to comment twice, but I've been a studier for philosophy for the past 4 years, and it's one of my majors. And one thing I have noticed is that philosophers are much more likely to step out of their bounds. I've noticed, one thing that me and Genji have in common, even though she is, from what I would see, she actually is she's pro-cultural rather, as in she looks to have a background in multiple cultures and be able to understand other people's cultures. And she as a white woman is someone that mindfully cultures that are not involved with that would see it. She had to step out of her expected role to gear towards that, to be able to have knowledge of that. I myself, as a straight black male, I've actually been an advocate for the LGBTQA community for over 4 years as well. That is something where it is seen that I had to step out of my bounds to do it, but I've seen that philosophers do have that ability from being able to look at things, or rather forcing ourselves to look at things from a different perspective, that we have opened up that ability, so to say, to be able to do that for anything that we really do put our minds.
It's good. Anyone?
Yes, well, now I have like a second thing to quick add to that, is that I agree with that last comment, and I think a huge part of that is because philosophers are trained from the beginning to question everything. If you immediately start from questioning everything, then you kind of are a little more open to thinking outside the box and doing like that. So if you are willing to accept that type of mentality, it's easier to wrap your head around an alternative. But that wasn't the main comment I wanted to go for. I actually, from personal experience, attended 3 different types of schooling through my youth. I started out at a parochial school, went to a private school, and then finished up at a public school. So I can actually attest to the variance of that. I do want to kind of just key, and I know I'm with you in most of your comments, so I'm with you on that part, is I definitely understand the struggle about funding and being able to get things reformed, because funding really does impact a huge part of education. But there is one thing that private schools will always have over public, and that is curriculum restrictions. Is that the government and other types of things, and there's other agendas influencing that, and one big thing that I actually wrote a senior thesis in high school about was standardized tests, is that there's actually subtle racism and biases and prejudices in standardized tests. And I would say through at least my personal experience in high school, when I was at private school, 90% of my classes were geared toward making sure they had a 90% success rate on the standardized tests. That I came from the highest, I will admit this, I came from the highest percentage graduation rate to go into college. My high school had a 99% rate of going into college. My school only also had 14 minority people, 14. And they considered it great on diversity day when they got 2 more people. That's really bad. That's really bad. So the one thing, it's yes, going from private to public would be great. That moves the funding, the people who can afford through scholarship or whatever to go to these private schools. However, it's also given them the opportunity to expand, to say, hey, we can actually do a grading system. The private school I went to actually did progress reports. They didn't do GPA until you hit high school because of college requirement stuff. But it wasn't about getting an A, it was, do you understand the material? And when you're not restricted to make sure that people have GPAs and that type of thing, that ace the ACT and have their SAT score to get to the next level, where education really blows your mind, is that you're really, really restricted. So I just wanted to see if, like, mostly Keegan, but if, you know, you guys all three kind of touched a little bit on the influence of teachers and that kind of thing, what your guys' thoughts were on that restriction, like standardized tests and government influence in that specific regard.
I think, one, thank you for making the point. You're completely right. There's a lot of insidious kinds of oppression that go on through testing and evaluation, even outside of standardized testing. I think that's an issue in public schools as well. So it definitely has to, this push for public school enrollment, well, I understand the private school enrollment too, with what you're saying in terms of getting outside of these harsh, strict restrictions on curriculum. And I think that we can both agree, like, this needs, the whole, like, purpose and goal of education needs to be revisited, retooled, and renegotiated in order to really solve the problem completely. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of progress that needs to be made in both the private and public school fronts if both are to continue. And maybe it is best that they both stick around.
I think this guy had a follow-up.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I've questions about the morality of, how do I phrase this? Of our way of structuring reality, and the people where, I'm from Virginia as well, where in one sense, you can have a segregated education where on one side of the city or the state, you have black people getting their education, and then their morality is we're going to offer education to African Americans and others on the other side of the street. You're not going to integrate, even today. You're not going to integrate. We're going to move to the suburbs. We're going to do whatever we need to maintain that segregation. But somehow feeling that, and I'm thinking of Kwame Anthony Apia's intrinsic and extrinsic models of racism. What is philosophy's response to how do we maintain a morality that allows us to keep that separate, even in the face of workshops, trainings on diversity and inclusion, all those things they proliferated, ubiquitous. Everywhere we find workshops on diversity and inclusion, but we still find most like racism as a family that justifies the fact that I'm not going to, if I'm white, let my child go to school in Kalamazoo when I can live in Portage. Or if I'm in Detroit, they're not going to Detroit schools. I'm going to move to West Bloomfield or to private schools to not let the interactions occur between people who are different. There is a deeper justification of that. And these people who aren't thinking of themselves as racist, there's something deep seemingly in us that allows us to justify those sorts of separations in education. Keep it on education. I know it goes beyond that.
Yeah, I was really lucky because I came from a small enough town that there was only one high school, and there were no private schools in the county either. So it was like black, white, rich, poor, everyone went to the same school, which I think was a huge benefit. And it was under old facilities and underfunded and all that, but it had a lot of great teachers, and the fact that it forced everyone together, I mean, really allowed for a tremendous amount of social progress in only a few decades, starting from when they had to be forced to integrate in the mid or the late 60s in my county, and there was still racially motivated violence in the school in the 70s and 80s. But it still allowed a lot of progress made in 30 years that wouldn't have been made otherwise if all the young people weren't forced together into one building that weren't in the same, and they would still try to maintain discrimination through that kind of partitioning of like tracking students and assigning them different tiers and all that. But even so, at least you were all in the same environment and had the same teachers. And that's why I personally am against private schools, because I think that's one of the vital functions of the public education system. And I mean, certainly I'm against public schools being funded by property taxes, which just couldn't be more overtly prejudicial in its impact or its intention, quite frankly. And you know, I understand there are good arguments made for private or charter schools in a more ideal setting, but it sounds like you made a lot of the rest of your comment was about, yeah, it's easy to say, oh yes, we shouldn't have discrimination, but the reality gets messier than just saying it. And then people find all sorts of excuses to say, oh yeah, I want to send my kid to public school, just not, that school with those people, I kind of think you have to, you're right, you have to strip away those pretenses. I've gone too long.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to comment on what you said, sort of a combination of what Genji and Pete mentioned. This whole educational discrimination, it's in attempts to sort of slowly reverse the last 260 years. Is what it is. It is a slow, progressive movement towards that, and it will not be something that will happen immediately. In fact, to be completely honest, it will not happen within any of our lifetime, or probably our children, rather. But what I see it as is that this educational piece, or rather this attempt to slowly educate and allow people to experience actual diversity. In fact, just not necessarily being taught diversity, because I can't we can't necessarily teach it, but what we can do is that we can put it in front of them to increase the likelihood of people personally making those choices to be that way. We cannot stop racism, but of course people will personally choose to be that way at some point in time. But through having an educational system where there is at least an attempt to make sure that there is no discrimination on the racial matter, what that does is that decreases the chances of people, people slowly becoming or people just being racist. I mean, KKK even in the 1960s, their number in the 4 millions. That means that 1 for every 100 Americans there was a KKK member. That is someone that can have a family. That is someone that can have grandchildren. And that was just in the 60s, and we see 40 years later, it does with 4 million people that can have families and whatnot. The chances of those numbers increasing are great. And it's the fact that itself, having those numbers, that is establishing that there was a culture there. And with this educational system, what I see it as, it is sort of an educational culture, rather, that is seeking to slowly counter that over time. And I feel that is something that we are doing as a country, that will slowly die down in numbers, or that will actually at least have an initiative to actually counteract the 260 plus years where, like we said, there was straight white male Christian norm that actually forced every other group that did not fit that category into either subservient slavery or being slaughtered. So I feel as though this educational it's answering to one thing that in time can answer to a lot of other things, or at least can bring them down to a point where where those that are racial or not naturally, will not have as much power, will not have as much say.
Keegan, you have a response?
Yeah, so I might be trying to pick up a thread between a bunch of conversations that isn't necessarily there, but I think part of the comment you were making was that in instances, philosophy actually is the method by which people justify racist beliefs and things like that. I mean, if you go back to the Atlantic slave trade, who were the people who were justifying slavery? It was philosophers. And that is one of, tragic doesn't even come close. And that is a big, big issue with these rhetorical tools that you can get from philosophy, is you can misapply them. And I think this is harkening back to what I guess both Genji and Andy were commenting on. Andy, in the sense that you have to clear the room of all this furniture that you might have and when you're approaching the world. And then Genji, in the way you have to clear the room before you have these experiences that allow you to actually have a structure that takes the way the world actually is and then uses the tools of philosophy. So that experiential engagement is super important first. And where you see philosophy going wrong is where they don't clear the room of the furniture that they have, the pre-existing notions, and they're engaging with the way they take the world to be as opposed to the way that the world actually is. And I think that is one of, the experiential learning is something that I think is super important. So I hope I'm speaking to comments that were made throughout the course of the discussion.
Man in the back.
Yes, so I understand that AP courses and accelerated courses can be like can segregate kids, but what do you think the solutions are for the kids that maybe need to be challenged, and then the other kids that maybe need a little bit more help, and how do you foster all different types of kids that are at different levels while in the same grade?
It looks like you're directing. Are you?
Well,
I
like
think Andy
you
has a
said, the
better
shoe
answer.
tying example, which and like then the accelerated courses, but really I don't care whoever responds. But.
May I respond?
Yes, absolutely.
So within a heterogeneous class, I mean a classroom that is all levels of sort of commonly aged students, you can sort of differentiate the instruction within the room so as to challenge the students who are either quickly processing the material or arrived sort of with a higher level of readiness than the other students. So you can embed something like an AP course within a non-AP course while still fostering the social interactions and et cetera, that are the reason to have heterogeneous classrooms in the first place, while still challenging those students, while still serving those in the middle, while still serving those with less readiness.
So like the Montessori example is kind of like kids learning at different levels, like doing their own kind of thing. I don't know much about it, but I briefly know about that. But it's also like a private school institution. So how do you like morph the public and the, because I like that aspect of it. I don't have kids, but I like that like learning aspect. But then you were talking about the private schools and how they take funding and all that other stuff that comes along with it. So.
So there's no
I don't know if that was a question.
there's no rule against innovation in public schools. Public schools are like, they have bureaucracies, they're slow moving, they're governed by statutes and stuff. So they're not free to do anything, but slowly but surely, your grandkids might have a lovely experience.
Well, that's up.
On a personal note, actually, my previous institution didn't have separate, it was undergrad institution, didn't have separate honors courses. Instead, they vetted the honors courses within the other course. So you wouldn't go in and have 20 honors students together and then the other course separate. And their reasoning behind that was they didn't want to separate the honors students from the other students because they thought there was an important interaction there.
Right.
So instead, you would have a 35-person classroom, and there would be 5 honors students embedded in that classroom that would get the exact same instruction, but would have additional projects or something for them.
But did the honors kids knew that they were in an honors?
They did,
doing
and other
honors
people knew
stuff?
that they were in the honors stuff. So
Right.
okay.
The parents would
It's
insist that they
complicated.
on a transcript, that's for sure.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, absolutely. Dale, did you have?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try to muddle through. See what we can do. Okay, so Jen, you talked a little bit about stuff that happened in the past, around people forward, right? Keegan, you were talking about things that happened in an elementary setting, kindergarten.
I would just interject that I'm talking about things that happened in the past, but also talking about things that are happening right now.
There you go. Okay, I'm gonna swing back to you then. Let's get to it. So I just want to air out a concern, and I mentioned this to a couple of you already. It's something that I've been dealing with since my fitting for today. A TA for a critical thinking course in the philosophy department. And so my concern is that I am given the straight white male version of critical thinking, and I don't know how to not do that. So I'm wondering if anybody in the panel has suggestions, or in the audience as well. It's just something that I just don't. I'm not sure I have the resources for it, but I'm interested.
I'd like an answer to that too, actually. I don't think I have one for you yet.
It seems like there should only be one kind of critical. Like, if you're talking about logic, there should only be one kind of logic. But then the question is the white male version that we've got the right?
Yeah.
So,
So here's
right.
the thing, I talk about things that are relevant to my life, like my wife and my child, but like that may have no bearing. I mean, just like age-wise and other students, that's fine, but also along gender or race lines as well. But specifically for today, race.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that need to be sort of disentangled here, which is that sometimes when people talk about, and this is a debate we have within philosophy, that you have such a thing as feminist philosophy and feminist epistemology or queer epistemology, and then you have some people, mostly straight white guys, who say, why does that need to be a thing? There's just epistemology, there's just knowledge, what are you doing? And the thing that gets conflated is the assumption that when we do that, we're inviting in some sort of subjectivism or relativism. We're like denying that there is an objective answer or objective truth or objective reality. And what's the assertion that's being made instead is not that there isn't objective truth, but it's that our relationship to it is indirect, and the only way we have to try to ascertain objective truth is through our subjective experience. And so when you throw that out as irrelevant, you're fundamentally going to be missing something in your account of what the truth is if you don't take phenomenology and lived experience into account. And that even more problematic is if all the people that are allowed to do the work have the same sort of experience, the same sort of body, etc., then that's going to become all these tacit and implicit assumptions that pollute their work. I'll go ahead and use the word as strong as that, because it's these things that they literally don't think twice about or don't think once about. You know what I mean? Like, they're things that just, oh, this is how it is for people. And it might be people from your circumstance. And because that is never addressed or thought of as subjective, it just gets taken without examination. It gets kind of Trojan horsed into what we perceive as an objective methodology and an objective truth. So I would say the way that you approach that and try to make it better is not by like being awkward or fearful about it, but honestly do the opposite. Be honest about what your subjective experience is and talk about your own life and your own lived experience and say, look, here's how my experience has shaped me as a philosopher and what my interests are and etc. And I leave it to, here's how I think that it informs like the views that I hold, and I leave it to all of you to decide whether that's influencing me in a negative way or not, whether it could be biasing what I'm presenting or not. And leave that to your students. In elementary school it's more complicated, but we're in college. I think the way to do it is to be truthful and to throw it out there and say, this is where I'm coming from. I try to be objective. I try to be unbiased. But if I do have biases that are going to be bleeding in, this is where they're going to be coming from. So be on the lookout.
I think it's a really good answer. I'm actually going to skip around here. To not be unfair to audience members and everyone, I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I'm going to kind of dismiss. But people that want to stay and still talk about this are welcome to, and maybe the people that have places to be can actually go ahead and leave without feeling like guilty for getting up. So, yes, sir.
Just to answer to what you said, in a similar fashion to what Genji said, I would say ask, study, and experience. Like as a matter of fact, I have a similar issue to you. I'm sorry, I have a similar issue to what you have, because as someone that's trying to be an advocate for allyship, one thing I can never do is that I can never be LGBT, right? So I can't actually physically experience that. But what I can do is that I can seek to ask, what it's like to experience it, or what it's like to see certain things. Like, for example, today, I noticed that a friend of mine that I usually see in the meetings, right, they have to dress differently or act differently when they're in public, right? So I asked that person, what is it like when you notice that when you feel so you cannot quite be yourself here as when you're among the rest of the group? And that person gives me their experience, and that person gives me their outlook on that. So that is my way of learning that. But basically, the thirstier you are, the more that you can actually know about it. Because the more you can actually know about it. Because I would say that even though I'm not LGBT, my brain allows me to, even though I'm not directly on that road, it doesn't mean I still cannot learn more than people that are expected to be on that road. Like I said, as a philosopher, we have the ability to go in places that we're not expected to be, but that doesn't mean that we cannot strive even higher than people that are expected to be on that road. So if you are hungry enough to actually like if you want to maybe go to different, as awkward as it might seem at times, like go to different Black organizations, sit in their meetings, or go to or the Latino community, go to their cultural events and whatnot. Anything that allows you to get the perspective that you want. If you aim your brain directly toward that, you'll be able to open up through just seeing how they experience it.
I'm actually let's go ahead and thank the panelists one more time. And now we can we're happy
Please
to
feel
stay
free.
as long as you want. I know Dan and Emily both had a question, and maybe Lucy. So, I think Emily was next, so Emily, if you wanna.
I mean, I can
sit
drop by
there.
the department whenever I want, so no
So Dan is in
worries.
the department every day.
That's true,
so-
but I have all the free time. I'm just a professor now. I don't have to write papers, any of that stuff that you guys do. So Keegan knows me because I was the second year last year, and I actually ran the first year meet and greet. So I haven't formally introduced myself to the other two, so I'll do that in a little bit.
She was me last year.
But worse.
Or I'm her this year.
But worse. I did the conference and John's job
She was
and 3
me
other
and-
conferences.
Me and Jared were her.
I was suicidal academically. That's the best way to put it.
You did get shortchanged, absolutely.
Anyone else?
Dan, you had a question?
No, I was just going to comment on some of the concerns that Dale was raising about how do you teach critical thinking without teaching in a biased way or pushing your thoughts on your students, whether it's about race or gender or politics or anything. And the way I structure my philosophy classes, my critical thinking classes specifically, is I want to see if I can get my students to get rid of some of the bad habits and pick up some good ones. And one thing that I spend particular time in focusing on is fallacies and rhetoric. Things like stereotyping. That's just not good reasoning. Why isn't it good reasoning? Well, I can show you, here's how good reasoning looks, here's how bad reasoning looks. Stereotyping is over here. And additionally, I take time to talk about freedom of speech. I take time to talk about what it might mean if you have a mental illness and speak to someone genuinely and honestly and in a respectful tone. Or if you're interested in talking about race, talk to each other in a respectful, genuine way, so we're not ridiculing each other, so we're not acting in ways that shut down the conversation. So if you want further discussion, sure we can have something further. And I didn't know if panels had anything else to add to that sort of teaching style.
I think Keegan did.
Mine's a really minor one. I just, this may or may not be successful, but I try and solicit experiences from the students. So as much as I can, try and work from examples that they provide. But still, even that is like my take on the examples that they provide. So if anything, that's like a half-assed solution that could use quite a bit of work.
Also,
Philosophers are so
Yes.
if you're talking about philosophy students, potential philosophy majors or minors, like I would also just say, from what I've seen and observed, the whole so-called partition between analytic and continental philosophy is something that's diminishing, being kind of deconstructed more and more, and there are more and more people who cross those lines within departments, and so phenomenology and talking about subjective experience was something that was considered for a time, oh, that's all continental stuff. And I see that changing. And, we have people in the building, Dr. Bailey and others, who will make the case, I certainly will, that no, you can absolutely take an analytic approach to phenomenology. So deconstructing that prop and getting rid of the stigma that, oh, if you're talking about subjective experience, it means you're not interested in objective truth, and there's no analytic way, there's no logical way to approach these things, and there's no objective truth value to abstract from subjective experience. I would say just getting rid of that stigma and saying, no, talking about your life doesn't mean you're not doing real philosophy.
Okay. Lindsay, did you have one, or did somebody already answer your question?
Someone did, but I was going to have a follow-up to Dale. Specific experiences, because you say you use a lot of your real life, which that's amazing for professors and teachers, just anyone just to relate to their students on a real level. But it's this cultural aspect, this racism that we're trying to get at. And from communication in our department, we're predominantly white females. And we were showing videos of predominantly white males in their speaking, and we were like, wait a second, this is a huge issue. So we had to go in and find different, just diversity of how to explain public speaking to thousands of students, and so it's, even though it takes a little bit of the personal tie to your examples, it helps students relate on a cultural level. But again, as Dan said, you just have to deliver it empathetically, and it's more challenging because we're not taking it from your personal life. You actually have to go out and research and look for these different examples. But from experience, it
questions, concerns? Okay, thank you guys so much for coming.
Thanks.